This is Sony's PXW-X180 camcorder. It's designed for news use, for solo video journalists, that kind of thing, and fly-on-the-wall documentaries. And it's the latest in a long line of illustrious camcorders of this ilk, which started, I suppose, at least over a decade ago. It must have been when the Z1 came out, and that was very widely used. Then, of course, there was the Z5, one of those, and there's also been the PXW-150, I think, was the successor to the Z5, and this is now the successor to that one. So it's fairly standard in Sony sort of terms. Anyone who's used one of these Sony camcorders before will immediately feel at home with this one. Let me give you a quick tour around it then, starting at the front. You've got one of Sony's G lenses. I don't know what a G lens means, but it's Sony's own brand for their lenses. And what's unusual about this one is that it's a 25 times optical zoom. And let me tell you, that's a lot of zoom. And if you are doing news gathering with one of these, as they are very popularly used for, 25 times optical zoom is definitely worth having, because there are some situations when you're filming where you simply cannot, for safety reasons or whatever, get in closer to the scene of the news story. But with a 25 times zoom, let me tell you, you can get in pretty close to the action. And as long as you've got a nice stable tripod, you should be able to get a good stable image as well. Now, it follows the style of the EX1 cameras and the PXW-200 cameras, things like that, in that the lens has two positions. With the lens ring back like this, it's got fixed end stops, so that's focusing at 0.8 of a metre away, and if you twiddle it all the way around there, that's infinity. And as you can see, the lens is actually marked with the distances that you're focusing at, so you can, at a pinch, just kind of look at what you're filming and go, about 5 metres, and put it on 5 and hope for the best, if you haven't got time to do all the usual zoom in, focus, reframe, etc. However, if you push the lens ring forward, it's now in completely free spinning mode, and that is a bit more like it used to be on the Z5, which only had the free spinning mode. It's a matter of personal preference which one you prefer. I know some journalists are so used to that they find it very odd to have end stops, and there are others, usually coming from the higher end, using one of these, who just can't get used to the idea of free spinning wheels at all and have to have it clicked back. But whichever way you do it, it's perfectly grabbable and turnable and easy enough to get focus using that ring. Immediately behind that then, you've got the zoom control, which you can operate, of course, from the normal zoom control here, or you've got the zoom knob here, or if you want to, there's a little tiny switch under here which you can just click between servo and manual. And when it's in manual, you can just rotate it yourself using the knob. So if you want to crash zoom into something, or if you want to get in faster, you can do the focus and come back out again. You can do it that way. I might as well just leave that on the normal rocker zoom. And then behind that, of course, you've got a little iris ring here. That is infinitely spinning. And it takes you from f1.6, I think, is the widest, down to f11, and then it closes after that. So that's the lens, the main feature of which, as I say, is that 25 times optical zoom. Coming back then, again, all very familiar stuff. You've got some assignable buttons here, 6 assignable buttons. And one thing I do particularly like about these, it's a really silly thing, but it's so helpful, is that Sony have put 2 tiny little nipples into the middle buttons, and that means that while you're filming away, eye up to the thing, you can just put your hand on there and feel instantly where your fingers are on the buttons, because you know if you can feel the little nipple, that's the middle button. And furthermore, they've put a little raised ring round the top line of buttons, so you're able to tell where you are, which line of buttons you're on, and which one is which. And that's just very helpful because, say for example, you're filming Her Majesty the Queen. She's come to visit the local primary school. You can't really say, "Excuse me, Your Majesty, hold on a second, just want to find the right button." Oh, she's gone. Oh. Whereas if you can just put your hand up there, feel the buttons and know which one you want, then obviously that's very helpful. So it's a silly little touch, but it's really nice in practical day-to-day terms. So I very much like that. Now, the other big selling point of this camcorder, I guess, is what lies immediately below those buttons. And it's the neutral density filters. Okay, no excitement there, you may be thinking. We've seen them before, but you probably haven't. First of all, you've got the standard switch, which is clear, position 1, 2 and 3. And by default, that's a 16th, no, quarter, 16th and 64th, I think. Anyway, the point is, it's settable. You can choose in the menus how much ND you want. And that's because this is not the usual ND filter. Normally when you're flicking this button in, on any other camcorder, you are physically sliding a filter into the lens assembly with a fixed amount of ND on it. But with this one, it's an electronic ND, and it's quite clever. I don't entirely know how it works, but I think it's some sort of LCD panel in the lens assembly that goes darker or lighter according to how you dial it in. And in that way, you're sort of creating as much or as little ND as you want. So that means great flexibility in that you can set the steps of ND however you want them. But also, if you flick this little switch here across to the right where it says variable, you've then got a little rollable knob here where you can literally dial as much ND in as you want on the fly. And that is useful, not only just for controlling exposure exactly as you wanted, but of course it does help you in getting those shallow depth of field shots if you want them, because obviously you want the iris as open as possible for shallow depth of field, but sometimes that would make the image too bright, and simply clicking in a stop of ND would be too much. But with this, open up the iris as much as you want, flick it onto variable ND, and then just dial in just the amount of ND you want. So it enables you to have a certain amount of creative freedom with this. Now, this being a 3/3" chips camcorder, the depth of field is actually pretty darn wide anyway, unless you're using quite a lot of that 25x zoom. But you can make it work, and it does work reasonably well. And you can see the difference as well in some shots between trying to do the shallow depth of field using the ordinary steps of ND and doing it with the iris fully open and dialing in as much ND as you want. Now, speaking of depth of field, I'll just jump ahead of myself here and mention one thing, which is that on the old, where is it? The old PXW-200, there we go, got a glimpse of that one. It had a very useful feature on the screen, which was a depth of field indicator. And when I first used it, I wasn't keen on it at all. But the more and more I've used it, the more I absolutely love it. It's just a simple bar graph on the screen that kind of tells you that between here and here is in focus. And again, when you're doing live event shooting, news, fly-on-the-wall doco, whatever, it's incredibly helpful. And for some reason, known only to Sony, it's not in the new camcorder. They've given you a different focusing aid instead, which is another bar graph, and the longer the bar graph goes, the more of the centre of the screen it thinks is in focus. But that's not the same as the very handy depth of field indicator we have on the PXW-200, and I wish they had put it back in. Now obviously it's a firmware feature, so in theory it wouldn't be too hard for Sony to re-implement that. So Sony, if you're watching this, please, 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 can we have the depth of field indicator from the PXW-200 in here, please? And if it is in and I've missed it in the menu somehow, then I apologise, but I'm pretty sure it isn't. So that's the variable ND. The rest of this, again, fairly standard. You've got audio controls here, you've got your status check button and menu button, and you've got gain and white balance knobs here. One thing I will mention about this, it applies not only to these knobs, but also these assignable functions here. There is a really weird and frankly annoying lag on using the controls. I found it whenever I was shooting with this. If you flick the gain in from 0 to 3 or whatever, it's not a long lag, but there is a lag, noticeable. You flick the switch and about, I don't know, quarter of a second later, it actually changes. And it sounds really silly because it's such a short time, but it's just enough to make it really annoying. On every other camcorder I've ever used, from that old Z5, the PXW-200, when you flick the switch, bang, it's in. And it's not that in the menus it's been set to do a gentle drift between the settings, because it doesn't matter what you do. When you press some of these other buttons, there's just this little delay in them coming in, and I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a firmware issue. I guess it must be. There is a new firmware version 2 out, but it doesn't make any mention in the documentation of that being addressed. But I found everything just a tiny bit laggy on those. And again, I don't think it's something I'm doing wrong, and if it is Sony, then I apologise. I'll put a note in the description below if I'm wrong, but I found there was just this little delay. And another annoying thing I'll mention while I'm on the subject, is that, and I can't see why Sony have done this, whenever you flick things like the gain, or change the white balance, or you turn the zebras on, or the peaking, the camera flashes up on screen quite a substantial banner along the the bottom third of the screen saying what you've just done. So you switch in 9 dB of gain, this whacking great banner comes on going, 9 dB of gain! It'll flash, flash, flash at you. I know, I just pressed the button. And what's more, of course, it tells you you've got 9 dB of gain at the top of the screen as well. There seems to be no way of turning off those flashing warning messages. I've been through the menus and I can't see a way of turning them off. And they're incredibly annoying. I can see no good reason for it unless someone at Sony has said, you know, these camcorders, they're mostly used by video journalists, and video journalists are morons, because that seems to be quite a widespread opinion that all solo VJs are idiots who can barely point a camera, and it's just not true. All right, there are some, but I know a lot of very, very good video journalists who really do know how to handle one of these, and they do not need big, shouty warning messages flashing in their face every time they switch something on, because if they're too stupid to know they've done that, they won't understand the warning message anyway. So please, Sony, make it an option to turn the big flashing banner messages off, because it's just annoying. And I return to my example of filming the Queen visiting the primary school. When you're trying to do that and you flick something because something's changed in the environment, you just need to add in a bit of gain or something, you do not want half the picture you're looking at obscured by this big flashing warning coming up on screen. Okay, deep breath, rant over. So that's that side of the camcorder. Let's have a look at the back. And you've got BPU type batteries powering that, as it was on the PMW-200 and the EX series before that. Storage is to S/S cards. You've got 2 slots, so you can do dual recording or continuous recording or whatever. You've got a little SD card slot there. Don't be confused. That's not for recording. That is for saving utility files like the settings of the camera and so on. And then you've got USB, so you can actually connect it up to a computer and transfer your files off. Over here, you've got HDMI, you've got SDI out, you've got timecode, Genlock, you've got some audio out under there as well. And then over here, there is another SD card slot, and that one actually is for recording files. It's for recording little proxy files, sort of lower res, lower bitrate files, which you can then transfer off using the Wi-Fi, because this model under here, I'll try and leave this off, it's quite awkward. Oh, there we go. There's a little communicatory device thing that gives you a Wi-Fi capability on the camcorder, which means you can transfer proxy files off and send them back for immediate breaking news kind of thing while you carry on filming in the high quality. The only difference between this model, the X180 and the X160, is the X160 doesn't have the Wi-Fi and it doesn't have the GPS. Apart from that, I believe they are the same. Carrying on round this side of the camcorder then, handle nicely positioned quite far forward. There's a decent feel when you're holding this in your hand. The balance, once you've got it like that, it's as these things are, quite bulky and heavy. Actually, let me show you something. Where's the Z5? The size difference between these two. I mean, the new one is massive. It's bigger, longer, fatter, wider. When you pick up a Z5, you suddenly think this one's tiny, and that's a good thing, because when you're running around shooting news, you do not want to be lugging around great big hulking camcorders. So this one could do with losing a few pounds, in my opinion. Where was I? Yes, round the side here. So you've got the normal hand grip there, you've got the normal rocker there, couple more assignable buttons on the edges here. That's by default an auto iris, and then this one here is the magnification to help you when you're setting the zoom. Now, one really annoying thing about that, you can see just above it, there's another button, which is the recording review button. So you press that, it plays you back the last thing you recorded, so you can check how it looked. But that one is not assignable. And what I find annoying about that is that when my hand is in here, this may not be true for everyone, but there it is, it's the rec review button that falls naturally to my fingertip when I want to do a zoom magnification for focusing. If I want that one, and I'm holding the camera with that camcorder, I actually have to brace the camcorder with my thumb, which runs the risk of accidentally hitting the start-stop recording button, and brace it in order to pull my finger back and hit the magnification button. Now, if only both of those were assignable. I could swap the focus magnification to what is now the Rec Review button, and that just for me would make that just so much easier. So again, Sony, you've missed a trick there. That could be assignable button 8. I'm sure that's only a firmware thing, and you could easily make that the case, and it would make life easier. What else? We've got the usual XLRs around that side, you know, a grip for a microphone there. You can set some of the settings. Oh, let me turn this around. You can set some of the settings on the XLR inputs there, whether you want them to have phantom power, whether they're line or microphone level. And on the top, again, fairly standard. You've got a zoom button, record button, cold shoe on the top, space for another accessory to be added on the back, or you can turn that into another cold shoe. The flip out screen comes out like that, and you've got controls for playing back your media and having a look at what you've just shot. Now, the screen itself, we've already talked about the really annoying warnings and things it has on it. For some reason, I wasn't terribly able to get comfortable with this screen when focusing. Don't know what it is, because on the PXW-200, no problem at all, absolutely twiddle the focus and I'll bang, pin sharp. On this one, I just kept finding myself, you know when you go almost to focus, and then you go through focus and past it, and then you just wiggle it back a bit. Normally you'd stop there and go, great, that's it. And on this one, I just kept finding myself going, never quite sure. And I'm not sure why, because the screen is, I think, reasonably high definition, but for some reason, something about it, I was never quite happy that I was in focus. Even using the expanded focus button, and zooming in and all that, I was still never quite confident. And I don't know why, but it just made me very slightly unhappy. General picture quality on the camcorder is kind of what you'd expect, really. I don't think I can say that it's extraordinary and it blew me away. It was an HD picture and it looked fine. I mean, this thing can record in several different formats. It can even do good old-fashioned DV. It can do, I think, AVC HD. It does the standard MPEG-2 422 that the old PXW-200 does. And of course, it now, it does say it on the camera, there we go, it does XAVC in 2 flavours. There's XAVC Intra and XAVC, I'm not sure what flavour it is, but some form of long GOP XAVC, which Sony's own Vegas editing software refused to properly recognise and just gave me some sort of weird picture breakup, even though it would understand the XAVC Intra. So I guess the warning there is, if you're thinking of using one of these in XAVC mode, check that your editing software will cope with the files coming off this. And if it won't, well, that's fine. You can always switch it into MPEG-2 422 because that's a broadcast standard. It's been used for ages and it's perfectly good. What else to mention on this camcorder then? We've been through several pros and several cons. I tell you one weird con, and that is the startup time. I've never known a camera take so long to start up. In fact, it bugged me so much I did a test between this, the PXW-200 and the Z5. The 200 I think came up in about 3 seconds and the Z5 in about 6. Those two may have been the other way around. This one, 12 seconds from off to ready to shoot. 12 seconds? By that point, Her Majesty the Queen has gone off somewhere else, let me tell you. I've never seen a camcorder so slow to start up. Again, must be a firmware issue, must be something Sony can address in a later edition of it. But for the moment, yeah, you better jolly well know that they're about to press the explosion on the demolition of the cooling towers, because by the time they've pressed it and you've got the thing running, everything will be demolished. The Queen will have moved on. The fire will have been put out. So that is just something to bear in mind. Let me talk briefly about low light. I've already said this is a 3rd-inch chip, or 3rd-inch chips. It's 3 3rd-inch chip camcorders. It is a substantial improvement on the old Z5. Poor old Z5, back in its day, that was quite good. This one blows it out the water. It's just brighter, much less noise, very much so. What really puzzled me was that when I put this up against the PXW-200, which, let's not forget, has 3 half-inch chips, substantially bigger, and it should have been way better. It wasn't. It wasn't. This actually did really well against the PXW-200, both in terms of just brightness, which, okay, you could just turn everything up and say, oh, look how bright it is, but even in terms of noise. The levels of noise on this I felt were pretty low, and I think it came out really well. I mean, that's just a sign of, I guess, the technology moving on, in that this one, being that much newer and that much cleverer in all its chippery, is able to make an image that is as good as, is it fair to say that, as the old PXW-200. I'm still pinching myself about that result. I went and did it again because I thought this can't be right, and it came out the same. So unless I've somehow managed to accidentally cripple my PXW-200, which I don't think I have, I would say this does very well indeed. So I think we've gone through that, haven't we? What I like about this, it's got that fabulous 25x zoom. It's got some good stabilization on it. Sony have put active stabilization on this, which is way better than the old, actually fairly useless stabilization on the previous generations of camcorders. This one actually does hold an image stable. You still wouldn't want to be at the far end of the zoom, but for normal, everyday shooting, it does do a reasonable job. It crops the image in fractionally and then uses those pixels to do the stabilization, but it does it pretty well. The variable ND is lovely. The assignable buttons, I do like that little feature there, apart from that one over there. This is another silly thing. I like the fact it's gone to a good old-fashioned on-off here round the record button. The old Z5 had the on-off here. The PXW-200, it was on the back of the camcorder here, and for some reason, I never quite got on with that. So it's nice that that's there. It's also nice that on the back of this one, you've got a good old-fashioned 2.5mm Lanc remote control socket. Again, the PXW-200 had some 5-6 pin weird control thing that was on the front of the camcorder here, so you had to sort of reach around and put the thing back in on itself, and I managed to bend the pins on mine, so not good. Whereas this one, just pop it in and Bob's your uncle. And that's about it. Headphone socket there, by the way, I forgot to mention that, which you can, with this switch, flick between it monitoring channel 1, channel 2, or the mix of channel 1 and channel 2. And that is good when you're doing interviews and you just want to hear the interviewee, say, plugged into channel 1, switch it and you can hear interviewee in channel 1 in both your ears. That is good. So those are the good points. The bad times, that startup, 12 seconds, that slight lag on the controls, which still slightly baffles me, the annoying banners flashing up on the screen, and the lack of that lovely depth of field indicator that the PXW-200 had. So overall, if you're in the market for one of this type of camcorder, for doing that news gathering, fly-on-the-wall documentary, it's probably a perfectly decent buy. They're not that expensive, relatively speaking, relatively durable, I guess, although it does feel a bit more plasticky than the old ones, you know, the previous models did. So how it will stand up to abuse in the field, I'm not entirely sure. That's about it. I hope that was of some use to you. Rather a whistle-stop tour of the PXW-X180, but I hope it was of some use. If you've got any questions, obviously drop a question in the comments below. And if this video was useful to you and you liked it, please do click on that like button. If you're not a subscriber to the channel, why not click on the subscribe button as well? And YouTube should tell you every time I upload a new video. It'll be in your My Subscriptions list anyway. Thank you as always for watching. Bye-bye.